The archivist sits behind a massive oak desk in the semi-darkness of a vast classical archive, slowly looking up into the camera. In 1857, Joseph Gayetty introduced his aloe-infused medicated paper to an American market that laughed openly at his commercial audacity, refusing to pay for something they could easily substitute with free pages from an old Sears catalog or a local political newspaper. What nobody knew at the time was that this local commercial failure would trigger a global cascade of manipulation, reshaping urban architecture, devastating pristine forests, and altering human anatomy. This mundane object was toilet paper. This is not a story about basic hygiene, but a chilling chronicle of how corporate forces financialized our deepest biological vulnerabilities to gain absolute control over global economics and body ownership. To comprehend the terrifying magnitude of this biological capture, we must journey backward into the visceral, stomach-churning realities of antiquity, long before the soft convenience of a paper roll existed. For millennia, the simple act of relieving oneself was accompanied by an agonizing gamble against infection, physical pain, and parasitic infestation. Consider the public latrines of ancient Rome, celebrated as triumphs of engineering, yet functioning as chambers of biological horror. The citizens of Rome did not have access to disposable hygiene products. Instead, they relied entirely upon an implement known as the tersorium. This primitive device was nothing more than a natural sea sponge securely bound to the end of a rough wooden stick. And no, I'm not making that up, for this object was completely communal. When a Roman finished their business, they reached for the shared tersorium, utilized it, and placed it back into a bucket of stagnant salt water or white vinegar. The next visitor picked up the exact same sponge, absorbing the acidic sting of the liquid and the microscopic pathogens of every previous user. These public restrooms became hyper-efficient incubators for intestinal parasites, roundworms, and deadly bacterial strains, transforming a daily biological necessity into a silent engine of widespread mortality that chroniclers of the empire routinely omitted from their grand histories of conquest. Further east, across the Aegean Sea, the ancient Greeks adopted an even more brutal, physically destructive methodology that left an indelible mark of suffering on the collective anatomy of the Mediterranean world. Rather than utilizing soft organic matter, Greek citizens relied upon what were known as pessoi, which were small, smooth, oval-shaped fragments of broken ceramic pottery or river stones. The physical reality of this practice was excruciatingly painful, as individuals literally scraped away bodily waste using sharp, unyielding clay edges that inevitably caused severe epidermal abrasions, deep microtears, and chronic, agonizing hemorrhoids. Archaeologists digging through ancient waste sites have recovered numerous pessoi, some of which were mockingly inscribed with the names of political enemies, proving that the Greeks literalized their political spite through an act of intense, painful bodily friction. For the lower classes of antiquity, the daily ritual was defined by a permanent state of physical discomfort, where the constant tearing of delicate tissue invited localized infections that could easily turn septic in an era devoid of antibiotics. The human body was forced to adapt to a cycle of perpetual irritation, an unspoken tax paid to nature by every human being from the lowest slave to the most celebrated philosopher. As the world slid into the dark, fractured centuries of the medieval period, the situation for the ordinary European peasant did not improve, but rather shifted into a rustic form of agrarian misery. The common folk, living in squalid hovels alongside their livestock, were entirely dependent on whatever seasonal vegetation could be gathered from the damp forest floor or the muddy banks of local rivers. They stuffed their communal privies with handfuls of coarse moss, dried corn cobs, scratchy straw, or rough hay, materials that provided minimal cleanliness while harboring insects, fungi, and irritating spores. For the absolute poorest segments of the feudal population, even these meager natural resources were a luxury, forcing them to rely entirely upon their own bare left hands, a visceral biological reality that gave rise to deep-seated cultural taboos and strict social codes regarding handshaking and eating etiquette that persist in various parts of the world to this day. In stark, hypocritical contrast, the wealthy elites and aristocratic rulers of the French court insulated themselves from this organic filth by utilizing the most luxurious textiles imaginable. French kings and high-ranking noblemen commanded their servants to provide them with squares of the finest combed wool, soft hemp, or intricate, hand-woven lace, which were used once and then discarded or meticulously washed by peasant laundresses who risked their own health handling the royal excrement. This stark biological divide established a fundamental historical truth. Throughout history, the comfort and cleanliness of one's body was the ultimate marker of class supremacy, a luxury that the vast majority of the human species could never hope to attain. The arrival of the printing press and the subsequent mass production of cheap paper in the early modern era provided a temporary, albeit hazardous, reprieve for a humanity desperate for an alternative to moss and pottery shards. By the middle of the 19th century, the rise of print capitalism meant that households were suddenly flooded with printed ephemera, most notably the iconic Old Farmer's Almanac and the ubiquitous mail-order catalogs of retail giants like Sears, Roebuck and Company. These publications were deliberately engineered with soft, unbound newsprint pages, and they were frequently hung from a simple nail in the wall of rural outhouses, serving a dual purpose as both reading material and a disposable hygiene tool. Millions of people across the Western Hemisphere developed a deeply ingrained dependency on these industrial waste products, viewing the written words of corporate advertisements and political columns as nothing more than a functional cloth substitute. However, this makeshift solution carried a hidden, toxic cost that remained completely invisible to the average citizen. The primitive inks utilized by printing presses of the era were heavily laced with toxic heavy metals, including lead, cadmium, and unstable chemical solvents that were directly absorbed into the human bloodstream through the highly permeable mucous membranes of the lower anatomy. For decades, families unwittingly poisoned themselves, experiencing mysterious neurological ailments, chronic inflammation, and severe localized dermatological outbreaks, entirely unaware that their trusted outhouse reading material was actively leaching industrial poisons into their bodies. This precarious equilibrium was completely shattered by the rapid, chaotic onset of the Industrial Revolution, an era that yanked millions of agrarian workers away from their rural outhouses and crammed them into the suffocating, hyperdense tenements of rapidly expanding industrial metropolises. As cities like London, New York, and Chicago swelled to breaking point, the old methods of waste disposal became an existential threat to public health, prompting the sudden, widespread adoption of the indoor water closet. These early flushing toilets, celebrated as triumphs of Victorian progress, were connected to primitive, newly constructed municipal sewage systems that relied on narrow, fragile networks of cast iron piping. Suddenly, the domestic habits of the working class collided violently with the rigid realities of modern urban engineering. The heavy, unyielding pages of the Sears catalog, the thick parchment of political newspapers, and the coarse corn cobs that people continued to flush down their new indoor commodes did not dissolve in water. Instead, they accumulated within the dark bends of the iron pipes, creating massive subterranean blockages. Entire apartment complexes were regularly subjected to catastrophic sewer backups, where torrents of raw, pathogenic human waste exploded backward out of toilet bowls, flooding domestic spaces, contaminating local drinking water supplies, and triggering devastating outbreaks of cholera and typhoid fever that slaughtered thousands of urban residents. It was precisely within this atmospheric nightmare of urban decay and plumbing failure that two enterprising brothers from Philadelphia, Edward and Arthur Scott, recognized an unprecedented commercial opportunity that would forever alter the fabric of daily life. In the late 19th century, the Scott brothers realized that if they could manufacture a thin, highly water-soluble paper tissue that could easily disintegrate within the narrow confines of cast iron pipes, they could monopolize the hygiene of the entire civilized world. Yet, as they prepared to launch their innovative perforated paper rolls, they ran headfirst into an impenetrable wall of deep-seated Victorian Puritanism and intense social shame. 19th century society was so profoundly repressed that the mere mention of bodily functions was considered an unforgivable social transgression, a taboo so absolute that it paralyzed the retail market. Department stores and local druggists flatly refused to display the Scott brothers' product on their shelves, fearing that the visible presence of such a vulgar item would offend the delicate sensibilities of their female clienteles and ruin their corporate reputations. The brothers themselves were so utterly terrified of social ostracization and commercial ruin that they refused to print the Scott family name anywhere on the product's packaging, choosing instead to operate in the shadows, quietly manufacturing the rolls for private, third-party distributors who marketed them under a confusing array of obscure, pseudonymous brand names. They lived in a state of constant professional anxiety, treating their revolutionary invention not as a proud family legacy, but as an embarrassing, dirty secret that had to be smuggled into the homes of consumers under the cover of darkness. The deep personal and professional isolation that characterized this era profoundly impacted the early pioneers of the industry, who found themselves trapped in a bizarre paradox where they were simultaneously saving urban infrastructure from collapse while being treated as pariahs by the very society they were rescuing. The historical records of the era reveal a landscape littered with failed hygiene patents and broken entrepreneurs who sank their entire life savings into perfecting the tissue roll, only to die in obscurity and poverty because they could not overcome the crushing weight of public silence. Inventors who attempted to market specialized dispensing mechanisms or medicated textures were routinely mocked by contemporary commentators or completely ignored by banks, leaving them financially ruined and emotionally broken. The psychological toll of working within a completely taboo industry meant that these early capitalists could never enjoy the public prestige afforded to the barons of steel, rail, or oil. They were the merchants of the unmentionable, forced to watch their multi-million-dollar innovations treated with a mixture of disgust and ridicule, their names deliberately scrubbed from the annals of celebrated industrial heroes, leaving behind a legacy defined entirely by the profound, collective discomfort of the human species. The breakthrough that finally cracked the vault of Victorian silence did not come from an awakening of public rationality, but from the brutal, calculated intervention of 20th-century corporate marketing, which realized that the most effective way to sell a taboo product was to aggressively weaponize human insecurity. As the industrial capacity of paper mills expanded exponentially following the conclusion of the First World War, corporate executives abandoned the timid, secretive strategies of the 19th century and pivoted toward a ruthless psychological campaign designed to manufacture a universal sense of somatic shame. They understood that if they could convince the average citizen that their current domestic habits were not merely outdated, but actively disgusting, socially disqualifying, and physically dangerous, they could transform an optional household commodity into an absolute, non-negotiable psychological necessity. Marketing firms began to systematically co-opt the emerging authority of modern medicine, plastering national magazines and newspapers with pseudoscientific advertisements that warned of the catastrophic health crises awaiting anyone foolish enough to use unspecialized paper products. This was the precise moment when the corporate state realized that the human body itself could be occupied, regulated, and monetized through the systematic cultivation of an invisible internal terror of social judgment. The archivist slowly removes his spectacles, wipes them deliberately with a muted silk handkerchief, and looks directly into the lens from behind his massive oak desk. His cold, calm expression illuminated only by the faint green glow of the banker's lamp. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about the modern world we inhabit. In the year 1935, the Northern Tissue Company completely revolutionized the global marketplace by launching a massive, multi-million-dollar advertising campaign centered around a single, shocking phrase. It proudly promised its customers a product that was completely splinter-free. Think about that for a second, and let the historical horror of that statement sink deeply into your consciousness. For decades prior to this corporate breakthrough, the manufacturing processes of industrial paper mills were so crude, unregulated, and aggressively cheap that the standard commercial paper rolls sold to the public routinely contained microscopic wood fragments, jagged splinters, and chemical residues. Millions of ordinary citizens had been quietly enduring the literal, physical agony of inserting wooden splinters into their most sensitive anatomical regions, suffering in total, paralyzed silence because the puritanical taboos of their era strictly forbade them from complaining aloud about the torturous reality of their daily hygiene. The corporate architects realized that they did not need to preach about cleanliness. They merely had to offer a desperate, suffering public a brief respite from physical mutilation, thereby transforming an act of survival into a multi-billion-dollar empire built entirely upon the weaponization of human body shame. If this hidden architecture of social manipulation surprises you, subscribe to the channel immediately, because the deeper we descend into these archives, the more the reality of our everyday world completely unravels. With the psychological floodgates wide open, the consumption of tissue paper transformed from a modest urban trend into a runaway macroeconomic phenomenon that quickly began to dictate the structural evolution of global trade networks and modern domestic architecture. Throughout the mid-20th century, the design of the contemporary home was completely overhauled to accommodate this newly manufactured dependency. Architects and suburban developers across North America and Western Europe began standardizing the layout of residential bathrooms around the precise dimensions of the paper roll, cutting recessed, ceramic-holding fixtures directly into the plaster walls of millions of newly constructed homes. This seemingly minor design choice locked the domestic space into a permanent, lifelong relationship with a single, consumable corporate product, ensuring that any future technological or hygienic alternative would require the literal destruction and remodeling of residential walls. At the exact same time, the geopolitical landscape of the post-war era was being quietly reshaped by the insatiable raw material demands of the tissue industry. Giant multinational corporations secured massive, highly exploitative logging concessions across the globe, exerting immense political leverage over governments to secure cheap access to vast tracts of ancient timberland. The simple household roll had successfully graduated from an unmentionable embarrassment into a dominant driver of international commerce, transforming vast ecosystems into corporate monocultures and integrating itself so deeply into the global supply chain that its sudden absence would instantly trigger widespread societal panic and domestic paralysis. This corporate victory, however, set the stage for an unprecedented era of ecological devastation and infrastructure captivity that represents the terrifying, invisible macro consequences of our soft, disposable convenience. Once the engineered fear of bacteria and the social stigma of bodily contact were permanently calcified within the collective Western psyche, the industrial machinery required to feed this addiction ballooned into an ecological apex predator. Think about that for a second, because the sheer, unvarnished mathematics of our modern hygiene habits defy rational comprehension. In the contemporary era, humanity flushes approximately 27,000 living trees down the toilet every single day, a relentless, non-stop slaughter of the planet's vital canopy that translates to nearly 10 million trees completely obliterated every single year purely to satisfy a fleeting, culturally conditioned sensation of temporary comfort. To satisfy this insatiable appetite for ultra-soft, multiply luxury, logging syndicates do not target fast-growing, sustainable pine plantations. Instead, they clear-cut vast, irreplaceable swathes of the ancient boreal forests of Canada and the pristine woodlands of Sweden. These complex, multi-thousand-year-old ecosystems, which serve as the primary carbon sinks of our planet and the last refuges for countless endangered species, are systematically razed to the ground, their ancient trees ground into pulp, bleached with toxic chlorine compounds, and rolled into disposable ribbons destined to exist for mere seconds before being discarded into subterranean voids. The environmental violence enacted upon the world's forests is matched only by the absurd, multi-billion-dollar captivity of Western urban infrastructure, which has been entirely engineered to serve as a specialized transportation network for liquefied cellulose fibers. Modern city sewer networks, stretching for millions of miles beneath our feet, are essentially highly volatile, incredibly expensive monuments to the toilet paper industry. Municipal governments are forced to expend astronomical sums of taxpayer money annually to maintain, repair, and clear these underground passages, which are constantly pushed to the brink of collapse by the sheer volume of paper waste and the monstrous formation of fatbergs, those colossal, congealed subterranean masses composed of coagulated cooking grease and supposedly flushable wipes that lock onto paper fibers like wet cement. What nobody knew at the time of these infrastructure developments was that Western capital was deliberately choosing to bankrupt municipal budgets rather than permit the adoption of infinitely superior, more sustainable hygienic alternatives. For generations, the multi-billion-dollar paper monopolies actively deployed their immense lobbying power, media influence, and marketing manipulation to systematically suppress, ridicule, and marginalize the technological solutions utilized by other global cultures, most notably the water-based bidet systems of Asia and the advanced electronic washing toilets of the Far East. By framing water-based cleanliness as foreign, bizarre, or unnecessary, the corporate cartels successfully protected their domestic clear-cutting empires, forcing hundreds of millions of people to remain completely reliant on dry, scratchy paper sheets that merely smear waste across the skin rather than cleansing it, ensuring a permanent, artificial market that continues to extract billions of dollars from the public while slowly choking the biosphere. The true depth of this systemic dependency becomes starkly apparent when one examines the volatile history of 20th-century geopolitical crises, where the availability of this single consumer item repeatedly served as the ultimate barometer of societal stability and psychological collapse. During the height of the Second World War, the bureaucratic machinery of the military-industrial complex quickly realized that the morale of millions of frontline soldiers was intimately tied to the consistent supply of standard hygiene tissue. Governments categorized paper production as a critical wartime industry, rationing paper supplies for civilian populations while military logistics units scrambled to transport millions of compressed rolls to trenches and naval vessels across both theaters of war. The total failure to provide these basic comforts frequently resulted in a rapid breakdown of military discipline and a catastrophic surge in debilitating camp infections, demonstrating that the grand strategies of elite generals were entirely subservient to the biological maintenance of the ordinary soldier's body. In the civilian sphere, the mere rumor of a factory slowdown or a supply chain interruption was enough to trigger immediate, animalistic hoarding behaviors among otherwise rational populations, a phenomenon that exposed the extreme fragility of the modern capitalist social contract. This collective madness reached its historical zenith during global supply shocks, when sudden, panicked rushes on supermarket shelves transformed the humble paper roll into a hyperinflated form of domestic currency. When structural anxieties gripped the collective consciousness, the human brain, completely severed from its ancestral knowledge of survival, bypassed essential survival needs like food or medicine, and fixated entirely on accumulating walls of wrapped cellulose tissue within their suburban homes. Think about that for a second, because this bizarre, irrational behavior perfectly illustrates the total triumph of corporate marketing over the human instinct for self-preservation. Behind this manufactured panic lies a darker, even more cynical macroeconomic reality. The tissue industry operates as an untouchable, recession-proof cartel that thrives directly on the permanent amplification of human physical vulnerability. Because the biological necessity of waste elimination cannot be delayed, negotiated, or boycotted, corporate executives possess a captive customer base encompassing the entire Western population from birth until death. This absolute market dominance allows multinational conglomerates to engage in subtle, highly predatory pricing strategies, such as shrinkflation, where they systematically reduce the physical square footage, sheet thickness, and roll density of their products while keeping prices stable or actively increasing them. They mask this extraction behind bright, colorful branding featuring cheerful cartoon animals, smiling families, and comforting imagery of pristine nature. A grotesque irony given that their factories are actively poisoning river systems with industrial effluent and wiping out the world's ancient forests. The consumer is left completely powerless, trapped within an artificial ecosystem where they must continuously pay an escalating tax to corporate gatekeepers simply to maintain a basic standard of physical decency that was completely fabricated by marketing executives less than a century ago. This continuous economic siphon operates silently, turning an inescapable biological process into an eternal stream of corporate revenue that remains entirely immune to market corrections or consumer resistance. Furthermore, the hidden human cost of this dependency extends far beyond the realm of economics and psychology, manifesting as a silent, widespread medical crisis that modern proctologists and dermatologists are only now beginning to openly acknowledge. The human anatomy was never evolutionarily designed to be cleansed through the aggressive, dry friction of bleached wood fibers. The constant, daily application of dry paper across highly sensitive, richly vascularized tissue acts as a continuous source of low-grade trauma, stripping away the natural lipid barriers of the skin, creating microscopic fissures, and exacerbating conditions such as chronic pruritus, anal fissures, and severe hemorrhoidal disease. To make the product commercially appealing and visually distinct, manufacturers routinely infuse their rolls with synthetic fragrances, chemical softeners, optical brighteners, and artificial dyes, substances that are known endocrine disruptors and potent allergens. When these industrial chemicals come into prolonged contact with permeable mucous membranes, they trigger localized allergic reactions, chronic inflammation, and cellular changes that require a completely separate suite of expensive medical interventions. The capitalist system has thus created a perfect, self-sustaining loop of exploitation. Corporate factories manufacture a product that actively damages human physiology, which in turn creates a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical market for specialized creams, ointments, and surgical procedures designed to soothe the very injuries caused by the paper itself. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about the profound hypocrisy of our modern standards of cleanliness. If an ordinary person were to walk outside, trip, and cover their hands or face in thick, organic mud, their immediate instinct would never be to simply take a dry piece of paper and wipe it across their skin until the visible stains disappeared. They would instinctively recognize that such an action would merely smear the filth deeper into their pores, leaving behind an invisible, highly unhygienic layer of bacteria and residue. Yet, because of the century of intensive psychological programming executed by the paper cartels, hundreds of millions of civilized adults perform this exact, irrational smearing ritual every single day on the most pathogen-dense region of their bodies, genuinely believing they have achieved a state of pristine purity. The absolute triumph of this industry lies in its ability to completely invert human logic, convincing an entire hemisphere of the globe that dry friction is superior to water-based washing, all to protect the profit margins of paper mills that cannot allow the public to realize that a simple faucet or a splash of water is infinitely healthier, cleaner, and more sustainable than the most luxurious 4-ply roll on the market. To uncover the final, most disturbing dimension of this hidden history, one must examine the dark, industrial symbiosis that formed between the mass production of tissue paper and the development of global chemical warfare infrastructure during the mid-20th century. The manufacturing process required to turn rough, dark tree bark into a pristine, snow-white sheet of soft consumer paper requires an astronomical volume of chemical bleaching agents, most notably elemental chlorine and its various highly toxic derivatives. Following the conclusion of the global conflicts of the early 20th century, chemical conglomerates found themselves with massive, industrial-scale surpluses of chlorine gas and chemical processing plants that had originally been constructed to manufacture weapons of mass destruction and toxic gases for the battlefield. Rather than dismantling these dangerous facilities, corporate executives realized they could repurpose this wartime infrastructure to serve the rapidly expanding consumer paper industry, using the toxic surpluses to bleach millions of tons of wood pulp to an artificial, blinding white color. This aesthetic choice was completely unnecessary for the functionality of the product, serving no hygienic purpose whatsoever, yet it was aggressively marketed to the public as the ultimate visual symbol of sterility and safety. What nobody knew at the time was that this massive chlorine bleaching process generated an invisible, incredibly lethal byproduct known as dioxins, one of the most potent, carcinogenic, and environmentally persistent toxic compounds ever created by human science. For decades, paper mills dumped millions of gallons of dioxin-laced wastewater directly into local river systems, permanently contaminating aquatic food chains, causing horrific birth defects in surrounding communities, and leaving a legacy of ecological poison that will persist for centuries, all to ensure that the modern consumer could wipe their body with a sheet of paper that looked perfectly white. The archivist slowly closes his massive folio, removing his glasses as he loops back to Joseph Gayetty's forgotten opening paradox. Human systems change, but our fundamental biological fears remain identical. If this history surprised you, subscribe and click the video now on your screen to dive deeper.